Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to yet more Warhammer 40k lore, and today we're going to talk about something very special indeed. Gorkamorka, in fact, and with a special focus, of course, on the Gretchin Revolutionary Committee, or Der Komitee, as they call it. But before we get into the funny fluff of it all, let's talk a little bit about the setting itself. Gorkamorka, a variety game, a spin-off, if you will, of Warhammer 40k, released in 1997. It was... how to best describe Gorkamorka? Imagine Necromunda or Mordheim, gang-focused skirmish-level games, and then you add in orcs, with all of the insane dice rolls that orcs used to have, with all manners of mechanical malfunctions, and of course the mob rule system. Then you add in extraordinarily volatile vehicle rules, and in fact, you make the vehicles themselves one of the primary focuses of the game, where you have groups ranging from about 10 to 15 to maybe even 20 orcs with their assorted vehicles, trucks, bikes, etc., all fight against each other whilst continuously rolling on a big old insane chart of random-ass nonsense. It was gloriously chaotic. And honestly, if there is one 40k license that desperately needs the good old video game treatment, oh god, it is Gorkamorka. Just the thought of playing a Mordheim-style game in Gorkamorka, where you throw in a bunch of cool turn-based tactics, lots of vehicles, and an insane chart of various mishaps, ooh, that would be very amusing indeed. But how precisely, you may ask, did all of this nonsense actually come to pass? How did the orcs end up on this desolate desert planet and decide to start racing around the place in ramshackle vehicles while firing wildly at anything that moves, including, for the most part, each other, in search for large piles of scrap metal? Because even for orcs, that sounds a little bit derpy and unmotivated. But, as always, the orcs really have a very, very good reason. Trust me. They always do, it's just that it isn't necessarily easily understood by the lesser races of the galaxy. You see, the orcs are looking for spare parts to try and fix their god, Gork. Or was it Mork? No, it was definitely Gork. Or no, it was Mork. Wait, no, Mork, Gork, no, Gorkamorka. That's it, yes. And as it so happens, their god, gods, possibly, is a Space Hulk. A very, very big one. Unfortunately, the orcs are not entirely aware that that is what it is. They refer to it as their miracle machine, their god, and it will, once sufficiently repaired, bring them back to the Great Warg, because as they have so astutely observed, the Warg is not where they are at the moment. And since they are orcs, not being where the Warg is obviously wrong. Now, naturally, the orcs used to know that this was a Space Hulk, but that was before their little religious argument over whether or not the Space Hulk was Gork or Mork got them stranded on the planet Angelus. Or, well, stranded is a slightly misleading term in this case. Before their religious bickering got themselves crash-landed on the planet Angelus. And whilst orcs are, of course, extraordinarily durable little creatures, falling out of literal space aboard a Space Hulk with very little in the way of concessions towards security, well, that is going to be putting a strain even on an orc's physiology. The handful of battered, scorched, and otherwise scarred survivors hauled their miserable little asses out of the Space Hulk, and after a few rounds of exchanged fire between the two still entirely alive and bickering religious faiths, simply stood in admiration of the massive canyon that their descent had created. The huge canyon carved into the landscape, known forever more simply as the Skid, had severely inconvenienced a party of Adeptus Mechanicus explorators. They had been in the middle of investigating a series of pyramid-like structures that had been found dotted across the planet. A planet, by the way, that was utterly devoid of life, all the way down to the microscopic level. Endeavouring to try and figure out precisely why this was, they were still neck-deep in their investigations when the orc made their ever-so-dramatic entrance. A fair few of them managed to dig themselves even deeper and survive the Orc Pact, but they went somewhat insane over their extended exile, since they were buried so far beneath the ground by the simple fact that the Space Hulk eventually ended up resting directly on top of them. They were also somewhat adversely affected by the Space Hulk's various energy sources, which were improperly shielded, shall we say. The combination of extended underground habitation plus massive amounts of leaking radiation eventually turned them into a rather funky little species that the orcs refer to as the Diggers. They have long since forgotten anything and everything about the fact that they once used to belong to the Imperium of Man. In fact, the orcs, being by far the most impressive thingamabobs they had seen in a very long time, they decided to simply start worshipping the orcs, an attempt to turn themselves into orcs. In fact, it is widely claimed amongst the more learned of orc individuals that they, recognizing the superiority of the orc fungoid species, are simply trying to evolve to a higher state of being. The orcs, in turn, viewed the Diggers with a mix of admiration, pity, and hunger, with the latter of those emotions eventually becoming dominant. As they tried to enslave and subsequently nom the humans, however, they discovered to their considerable detriment that the inhabitants of the pyramids that the AdMech had been studying had taken quite the shine to its new human inhabitants and had decided to protect them. These were, of course, the Necrons. Now, as to why Necrons decided to protect humans, well, it probably has something to do with the rather considerable impact that the Gorkamorka had upon the planet. The somewhat sudden entrance undoubtedly knocked loose some very, very important screws that had the various Necron constructs look upon the humans and go, "Massa must protect from mean orkies." And as a result of this, whenever the orcs have tried to enslave or otherwise inconvenience the humans, the Necrons have gotten very, very angry indeed, and responded in the only language the orcs seem to understand: overwhelming amounts of violence. There was also a group of AdMech in orbit, in fact on a ship that just so happened to be right in the path of Gorkamorka as it made its none-too-elegant descent upon the planet. Understandably somewhat shocked and perturbed by this turn of event, they did everything they could to avoid a head-on collision, as such an impact would turn their proud AdMech ship into barely so much as a wet smudge on the front of the Space Hulk. Their somewhat desperate evasive measures, however, also got them caught in Angelus's gravitational field, and eventually had their ship crash as well. Now, the Adeptus Mechanicus is also a rather tough little bunch, and they had actually outfitted their ship with something at least vaguely resembling security protocols, which allowed a considerable portion of them to survive. Unfortunately, in the impact, their reactor had also sprung a rather severe leak, which affected them just as badly as the Diggers. However, they managed to remember where they came from, and so, despite being devolved over the years into a race of horrific mutants, they are still fully aware of the fact that they belong to the Imperium of Man, not the Imperium of Orcs. As such, they are currently searching for a way to wipe every single green-skinned little monstrosity off the planet. And probably the Diggers as well, seeing as they have been cavorting around Xenos for just a bit too long for comfort. The orcs, meanwhile, are blissfully unaware that there is anything such as a wider species. All they know is that if they can eventually bring enough scrap to their god, then their god will once again awaken and bring them to the Greater Warg. They don't really have any idea what that might actually entail, but they do know for sure that it would be a very, very good thing indeed. And the only thing stopping them from rejoining the Great Warg was the tiny little inconvenience of the fact that their starship was scattered across half the planet. With the usual orc single-mindedness, they began banding together and spreading their orky ways across the planet, producing vast quantities of spores and therefore vast quantities of brand new shiny orkies to help find the missing pieces. Eventually, they had fully rebuilt Gork and Mork, Or was it Gork? No, it's Mork. No, it's Gork. Look at it. It's brutal, yes, but it's also cunning. It's Mork. Shut your mouth. No, you shut your mouth. Bang, bang, bang. Explosions. Everything happening at once. You remember the reason why they crashed in the first place? Yeah, that. All over again. And one of the countless casualties of this brief, albeit also extraordinarily violent, religious schism was the Space Hulk Gork, or Mork, itself. Eventually, the mech boys, having gotten a fucking enough of seeing their shit destroyed all the goddamn time, called a truce. The orcs put their brilliant minds together and came up with a solution. The ship was both Gork and Mork. Naturally, this resolution came just a few moments too late to actually save the Space Hulk, so now the orcs had to start all over again. It had taken half a century to rebuild it the first time, and now, considering they'd also utilized the vast majority of their scrounged arsenal on it, it was probably going to take considerably longer to rebuild it this time. There was also constant little upflarings of their previous religious schisms, where one part would build something that the other party thought looked suspiciously much like one orcish god, rather than the other orcish god. And in such a complex diplomatic situation, the only real solution was to aim something large and shooty at it and blow it to smithereens before anybody notices. Naturally, this particular form of theocratic discourse took quite a toll upon the Space Hulk. It had started out as a very, very large ship indeed, but as their fiery rhetoric continued unabated, pieces got blown off again and again and again. And additionally, the orc numbers increased, and increased, and increased, until eventually the mechs were starting to think that, boy, there is absolutely no way in green god heaven we're gonna fit all of these orcs on this spacecraft. Additionally, they were getting worried that more and more of the orcs were choosing to engage in theocratic conversations via shooters, rather than actually finding scrap metal. So they came up with a system of incentives. Every time a mob brought in a piece of scrap, they would receive a tag. And finally, on the promised day, when their god Gorkamorka rose once again from the desert floor and ventured up into the cold beyond to rejoin the Great Warg, whether or not you would be on it would depend entirely on how many tags you possessed. The ruling Mech Council also made a decision that was going to be, well, interesting, if nothing else. They determined that Grots and Gretchin, not being proper greenskins, of course, simply could not obtain tags, which effectively meant they would be stranded on the planet for all eternity. This was obviously perceived by the diminutive little greenskins as highly unfair, especially as they did just as much work in gathering scrap as the big boys did, and perhaps even more importantly, it was the Grots and the Gretchins that actually put that scrap together into something that might be vaguely useful. It was indeed a common sentiment among the lesser greenskins that the mechs really only got in the way most of the time anyways. Of course, this isn't the first time the Grots have gotten delusions of grandeur into their tiny little green heads and decided that it's time to overthrow their green overlords, and usually these Grot uprisings are extraordinarily brief, not particularly violent, and the orcs barely notice that they've even happened. But this time, the Gretchins had something special up their sleeves. That's damn right, comrades. The revolution rises, with the infamous Red Gobbo at its head. This red little greenskin eventually formed the Gretchin Revolutionary Committee, often referred to by the rest of the orcs as simply the Rebel Grots. The Gretchin Revolutionary Committee, or GRC for short, found it extraordinarily unfair and downright unsocialist that only the big lads should be allowed to get off the planet when they were finally finished building Gorkamorka. They maintained that all the resources should be shared evenly across greenskin kind, although, of course, some greenskins are more equal than others. And in this particular case, Grots and Gretchin were obviously far, far more equal than the tyrannical and selfish orcs. And it is only natural, but it must still be stated, with such a noble and selfless goal at its head, the revolution will undoubtedly succeed. Although, to be fair, no actual progress has really been made yet. It turns out that Grots and Gretchin, regardless of how much revolutionary spirit they have in their tiny green little hearts, they remain basically worthless fighters. But, to be fair, they have done considerably better than pretty much every single Grot and Gretchin uprising before them, in that they're not all dead yet. Which, considering the downright unfair disparity between Orc boys and Gretchins in a straight-up fight, is quite the achievement. An achievement usually attributed to the Grot's brand new innovative tactic known as Grot warfare, or as we would refer to it, guerrilla warfare. Considering that pretty much the only advantages a Gretchin has over an Orc is that he is slightly smarter, about 2%, and has slightly better eyesight, meaning that he's actually capable of firing a gun in the general direction of the enemy with at least a 14% chance of hitting something. Not necessarily the enemy, mind you, but something, definitely. Unfortunately, the revolutionary spirit has also led to some small problems within the revolution itself. The Red Gobbo has gotten himself into a rather comfortable position, shall we say, and he is very, very hesitant to hand out his oh-so-thoroughly well-earned personal wealth in the name of the less competent members of the revolution. In other words, he is a remarkably stingy little bastard, and getting access to any kind of real equipment from him is difficult, to put it mildly. And considering the Grots are fighting a war here, equipment is kinda necessary, since it's going to be extraordinarily difficult for even 100 Grots to beat a single Orc boy to death with nothing but harsh words and their tiny little childlike fists. This rather unfortunate strategic position, which can charitably be described as asymmetrical warfare or uncharitably as a violent one-way gangbang in a dark street, has led many Gretchin commanders to realize that if they can't get weapons, they can't win. But if they don't win, they can't get weapons. So what is the solution then? Well, lying, obviously. The commanders of the Gretchin revolutionary armies have perfected the art of elaborating on the truth. Should they happen to kill one Orc, for example, it mysteriously turns into 100 Orcs in the official report. Should they happen to blow up a war track, it will be described as the destruction of an entire Orc battle fortress. Should they succeed in sabotaging some ancillary system on Gorkamorka to delay the inevitable departure, that will be described as a war-winning measure that will undoubtedly ground the giant Orc god until righteous victory has finally been achieved for La Revolution. Of course, the Red Gobbo isn't a complete idiot, and he has, on occasion, attempted to counteract this unfortunate habit of inflating victories ever so slightly by introducing commissars. The problem, of course, was that the commissars were Gretchin as well, and so in most cases, they simply just asked for a cut of whatever the commander managed to embezzle away from the Red Gobbo, so that didn't help much. Additionally, morale started plummeting once news of great, fantastic, war-changing victories started drying up. So in the name of maintaining morale, the Red Gobbo decided that as long as their lives were at least somewhat believable, then it doesn't really matter if the Gretchin in question is truly red or truly green, as long as it gathers victories for La Revolution. The road ahead for the Red Gobbo and his revolutionary compatriots might be long indeed, and undoubtedly extraordinarily stony and uncomfortable, but one day, one beautiful day when finally Gorkamorka rises from the planet below, straining its massive engines to lift its bulk up from the desert floor, the Red Gobbo will undoubtedly be at the helm. Whether or not any of his revolutionary compatriots will still be around to enjoy this victory, well, that is for the future to decide. Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.